I'm Alistair Duff, and I'm proud to be a visiting affiliate professor at the University of Glasgow. And I'm really pleased to be inputting to this currents course, which I think is a great course. I spoke last time about the current information space, and my topic today is the current power scene. Here's the structure of the lecture. I want to talk a bit about the classical framework for understanding power. And then I wanted to come on to two influential modern frameworks for understanding it, micropower and soft power. And thirdly, I'll come on to what I suppose is my specialism, which is information age thinking. And I want to introduce you to three frameworks. First of all, informational power, these overlap. Secondly, communication power. And thirdly, fifth estate power. So the best starting place for an understanding of power is undoubtedly found in the work of the pioneering sociologist Max Weber, whom I trust you have heard of. And he makes an important distinction between power, which can be wielded by gangsters, and authority. Authority, then, is a subtype of power in which people give their consent to an authority. They obey commands because they see the exercise of power as legitimate. So the naked power of a lawless neighborhood gang is not authority. And he says, and I think he's correct, that politics is or should be about converting power into authority. So let's look at his definitions, because definitions are terribly important. Power, he said, and this is a famous definition, is the probability that one actor within a social relationship will be in a position to carry out his, it was always his, wasn't it, his or her own will despite resistance. And he also defined domination as the probability that a command with a given specific content will be obeyed by a given group of persons. So what about authority? He said there are three pure types, and he coined the term ideal types. I've put a definition at the bottom of the screen. Three pure types or ideal types of authority. So the validity of claims to legitimacy can be based on rational grounds, that is, resting on a belief in the legality of enacted rules and the right of those elevated to authority under such rules to issue commands. And this is legal authority, which we associate with democracy. Secondly, there is traditional authority, which rests on a belief among the people in the sanctity of immemorial traditions and the legitimacy of those exercising authority under these traditions. And thirdly, charismatic authority, and Weber is very famous for singling this out. This rests on a devotion to the exceptional sanctity, heroism, or exemplary character of an individual person and the vision, or as he puts it, the normative patterns or order revealed or ordained by him. Interestingly, Weber imported this term from theology to sociology because it originally meant charismata, which were gifts of the spirit. And he imported that idea of charismatic, being charismatic, into sociology very, very influentially. Okay, so let's unpack these a little. The first, rational legal authority, is about organization, bureaucracy, and it's populated by officials with rational functions. The rules are established with public procedures. Secondly, oh, well, there's an example, the Scottish government, which was duly elected a few years ago and will face re-election or deselection in 2026. Secondly, traditional authority tends to involve not officials, but favorites. And it's often associated with or embedded in patriarchy, and rules are embodied in ancient or sacred customs, which are more or less obscure sometimes rather than being public. A good example was the late British Queen. She had no political power, but she had a kind of traditional authority, didn't she? And then Iran's clerical system is a good example, and so is the Saudi Arabian monarchy. The third, charismatic authority, is where followers freely recognize the individual's authority, and it's based largely on personality. The rules really that have allowed this to come to the fore are not rational, legal, or customary, but it's a kind of over and above that. And a great example, excuse me, was the civil rights leader, Martin Luther King, whom of course you know. You might not have heard of Tony Benn, but he was a great British left-wing politician who died a few years ago and was very charismatic. I think it makes sense to look up some of his speeches on YouTube because he was one of the most effective speakers of the 20th century in Britain. Alex Salmond, the late leader of the Alba Independence Party, prior to that the SNP, he had charismatic authority. I know that because I got to know him a bit, and he definitely had a great vitality about him and a great charisma. Another one would be a guy called Alexis Tsipras of the Syriza movement. I don't know if you know about it, but it rose to power very quickly about 10 years ago in Greece. It's faded somewhat since, but Tsipras had a lot of charisma and he brought the people on board in Greece. Well, I have to mention Donald Trump. And I've heard his speeches actually, and he is very engaging. He does have a kind of charismatic authority. And then Nigel Farage in Britain. Perhaps one should mention here something that's exercising a lot of politicians and political scientists, which is the rise of populism, which is basically a revolt, an outsiders revolt, or at least populist leaders claim to be outsiders. Outside from what? What are they revolting against? The establishment, what C. Wright Mills called the power elite, or what's sometimes called the political class. And there's a very good book by Agnesh Horvath and colleagues entitled Modern Leaders. All of my references will be on my final slide. Modern Leaders Between Charisma and Trickery. And they argue that populists are actually tricksters. And there's a lot in that, confidence tricksters. But one must note that the problem with populism is that it's popular. So there is something in it that is appealing to ordinary people. There was an advert in the 1970s for a beer called Heineken, which is still around. And it was a TV ad. You had a guy sipping from a Heineken can, and then a few seconds later, his toes start wriggling. And the strap line was Heineken refreshes the parts other beers can't reach. And that is what these populist leaders do. So let's understand it and not just dismiss it. Okay, so Weber is the framework. I think anyone lecturing on power would start with Weber, unless they wanted to go right back to the ancients like Aristotle, which I'm not going to do. So what about modern frameworks? Weber was early 20th century. What about modern frameworks for understanding power? Well, there have been some breakthroughs, important ones. And the first one was brokered by Michel Foucault. Weber was German, Foucault was French, and he discovered, arguably, a whole continent, the whole hidden world of what he called micropower. So he starts by saying we need an analysis, excuse me, which goes beyond the two prevalent accounts of power. Firstly, the juridical theory, which has power located in the state and its apparatus, and which obsesses over sovereignty. That was the great term for hundreds of years, sovereignty. So that's about state power, kingly power before there was democratic state power. And then in the 19th century, of course, along come the socialists, and especially Karl Marx, who was the brightest of the socialists. And he developed an economistic theory of power. And he said, don't look at the state apparatus, which is just a superstructure. Look at the social relations of production. Look at the economy, and you'll find that real power is located in the rich, in the owners of capital, in property owners. So, of course, that is classical Marxism. Well, Foucault, although he was pretty Marxist, thought we need to go beyond that, because it's not just about top-down relations, power. Power flows also in zigzags, power flows horizontally, and power flows upwards as well. And he talked, and I love this term, about capillary power. Power which flows through the small veins of everyday life